Welcome to day 4 of our webinar series, pre-flight series to focusing on helping first-time grant writers. For today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on the budget. This one can be one of the more challenging aspects. Having many ideas, having many, putting things together, opportunity. We're never quite sure, does the idea drive the budget or does the budget drive the idea? And the focus. And I think for many people, especially anybody who has gone through a dissertation process, the key is always focusing it down. The same for the budget. So welcome again. Thank you.
We start off with one of the things that I've noticed with first time or early proposals, people writing our proposals, grant writers, that the budget seems to be a very intimidating portion of it. I think part because many times when you've got someone new to the grant writing process, they may not be someone who's been in charge of budgets, may not know what certain costs might be involved in it. And it's always simple to kind of just place that in the back burner and let's talk about, writing our narratives, getting some people, everything that we've been talking about so far, which is absolutely necessary. But the lagging of the budget, of kind of tying it together, can cause a little bit of a problem at the end when suddenly there's a big disconnect in that process. Melissa, for when you're working on a proposal, how do you work with budget, or what are some thoughts that you kind of put together?
Well, I approach the budget a very first thing. Once I have kind of a summary and a general idea what I want to do for the project, then I think the budget really needs to be the very next thing, because that's going to really determine the scope of what you can propose. As a reviewer also, it's really kind of a kiss of death when you're reading through a proposal and what people are proposing, they're proposing big things, and then you look at their budget and either there's not enough money there to get it done, or they're proposing things that are not addressed in the budget. There's no money at all for some particular element. Then reviewer gets really skeptical and thinks, okay, this is not going to get done. On the other hand, it's just as bad if the budget is really padded. Then reviewers get really irritated. It's like, oh, this is taxpayer money that you're proposing to waste. Right? So I think it's really key to in developing the project, to understand what's realistic in developing the project. I think it's really key to get a handle on how much you can afford with the budget early on. And then for competitiveness, I think it's really key that what you're proposing match perfectly, or as well as you can make it, with what the budget is to get the job done.
Budget is very early on. In fact, many times I'll pick up an RFA and look at what the budget restrictions are, in terms of what you can and cannot spend from the available funding. If there's any cost share involved, that may be that's a game changer right away in terms of how much cost share and what kind of cost share, whether it's in kind or cash, et cetera. And so then once you know that little basic information and you see and say it's just a $500,000 budget, then you start in your mind pulling together, okay, what's that going to afford less the indirect costs for that, and what can I get done with it? And so you start, I start building actually a quick little, on the back of a napkin, if you will, but I actually put it in a spreadsheet. I got several budget templates that I can populate with numbers right away, with personnel numbers that already have the salary base and benefits figures already calculated in it. So I just put in a wage and right away, and you'll be surprised how quickly that all disappears. How quickly 500,000 disappears when you got 3 or 4 people you're trying to work and a program that you're trying to implement that's got supplies and other important items. It goes very quickly. So I think budget, like Melissa said, once you have an idea of what you really want to do written down, doing a budget exercise is a good idea.
Right. And as a reviewer, Paul, when do you look at the budget? When you're reviewing grants, when do you look at the budget?
Well, I'm actually sitting on a review panel right now, USDA review panel, and it's actually back to back, and I've looked at some 20-some proposals, and I'll immediately look at the executive summary and see what institutions or how many institutions are involved. So just a kind of this is what we want to do, kind of a summary. And then I go right to the budget and then look at the first year budget to kind of see how they're going to allocate their expenses in terms of personnel. Then I'll go to the summary budget, not necessarily every year. I'll just go from first year to the summary and see how that all adds up over a proposed project period. So typically they're anywhere from 3 to 5 years. So if you can get an idea what they're trying to spend the first year, then look at the last year, you get an idea of where all the money's flowing and where they're really committing resources to. As you read through the proposal, you know, and they got their goals, objectives, and activities, and start to see, well, does that make sense with the budget I just looked at?
I think also important that I've seen in a few proposals have been when there are multiple colleges or institutions working together to make sure that there's equability across the institutions. Because I think as a reviewer, we definitely would not want to see that a main institution is saying that all these other institutions will be contributing and doing these activities, but yet there's no financial commitment to those institutions. And to me, it raises a couple of flags of, are they really committed to have them working, and two, are these other institutions, if there is no compensation, what is their incentive to really be viable in the application?
Absolutely, because the budget is the operational plan for the proposal. And if particularly across institutions, if the commitment of effort from an institution is completely disproportionate to the amount of resources they're going to get from the grant, another thing reviewers think, okay, this is not going to happen. And so then they're going to really downgrade the proposal.
If your institution's going to give you time, release time to work on that, and you really do want to put that in there, because there can be a disconnect from the actual funding you receive from the funder versus what the institution's willing to commit. Not necessarily a cost share, but your time commitment to the project needs to be well documented.
Do you think probably some people that aren't very experienced in grantsmanship and writing proposals have a fear that putting in for requests for salaries or offset, that's looked disfavorably upon the funder?
I think that then they're not thinking about it the right way. But particularly what reviewers are looking for is, if there's not money to cover somebody's effort, then the likelihood they'll actually contribute that effort is pretty low. It shows, it's commitment, right? So resources in the budget is leverage to actually get commitment from the person to get them to carry out the work that they are assigned to do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's going back to, reading the budget narrative in the proposal right away and seeing what kind of restrictions, because some RFAs may say not over a certain percentage spent in faculty or personnel issues, or we'd like to see 20% go to graduate students. And so there are those things that, okay, now I got a budget for that. Is that going to work with what the scope of work I was hoping to do? And so Melissa's right, is that if you want to get commitment from a faculty member and or a key personnel, having some resources to support them is not a bad idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And I think it's also not just the commitment from the individual, but the commitment from the institution. Mm-hmm. Because if the institution is saying that we are releasing this individual from other responsibilities, then they have to have a commitment to say we are allowing them time to work on the grant.
Right. And if there's not money to buy out people's time, what you really need to have support letter from the institution saying the institution is going to give them that time. And if you have that, then it's just as good as money. It's just as good as money in the budget, but you got to have one or the other.
Melissa, you have a budget template that you could share with us?
Yeah, I was thinking I would kind of walk through the process that I use to prepare budgets for proposals that I'm working on and give people an idea about one way to get started. And I'll share my screen, but for people who might be intimidated by doing this and think that this is difficult or not a fun part of the proposal, put yourself in the mindset you just won the lottery, right? You have some money and you got to figure out how to spend it. So I think developing the budget is really some of the most fun part, because you can pretend you're spending money, right? It's like you got free money and you're going to figure out what's the best way to spend it. So this is a spreadsheet. This looks pretty complicated because it's very comprehensive, and you don't probably need such a complicated, you won't need such a complicated spreadsheet in order to give you a basic idea of what your budget is. But I wanted to show you kind of, if you're doing a lot of grants, you'll want to develop something a little bit like this, because it has formulas and is all set up, because it does make things easier down the road when you go to enter the budget information into your portals, to go to submit it, provide budget information to your institution. This is kind of how it's set up. The key thing is, this is set up for up to a 5-year grant, right? So we've got all these years and a cumulative. And these, where they're zeros, they're formulas. We have different, so for each year, we have different budget categories. So I have personnel, and this is just set up sort of as a generic template with the kinds of personnel that there might be on a grant. So the first series is the salary, and then it totals at the bottom. The second series is the fringes, which it doesn't say, but it's the fringes and it totals at the bottom. Then we have a line where it all totals for salary and fringes, so the total personnel cost. And then below are all the other things: travel, equipment, supplies, and then contracts. And we have a couple different lines for contracts, and there are some typical things that people ask for: an external evaluator, workshops or speakers. These could be changed out for other things. There's a category called other, and this spreadsheet in general corresponds to the categories that are going to be on most budget portals or on the budget forms for most grants. So salary, benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual are really common budget categories for grants. So contractual can include, right, your consultants. Some places call it consultant/contractual. And then there's an other category, which is sort of the grab bag of everything else. This can be if you're going to budget money to pay for publication fees. This is an example. Subject payments. My colleagues that do human subjects research, where they have to pay people to take surveys or to go through their procedures, these subject payments fall under other. And then there's the other under other, which is kind of what have you. Participants' costs are generally funds for students or for people who are in some kind of training. So participants are those that are getting trained. And then under participant costs, we have it broken out by travel, tuition, if they're students, stipends, and then subsistence would be for if they're staying in a dorm. If this would be for a summer program or some kind of training program that involves paying living costs. So, so it's year one. It's like, oh, okay, I've got this grant. I'm going to start with year one. So if I'm the PI, then I'll put in here the name of the person and one line for academic year salary. And so if we were going to do, say, a couple months, let's just say that their salary is basically $80,000 a year. I would put, and they're going to get 25% release time. Simple way to do this is 25% or 80,000, the academic year salary, times 0.25, right? And then see, because I've got these formulas, right, that all fills in. So academic year salary is about 20,000, that's a quarter. And then the summer salary, right, say they're going to pay themselves 1 month of summer salary. As a PI, I would pay myself 1 month of summer salary. So we can do this formula again. And then probably the easy way to do this is just by 9. That's, I need one more zero. There we go. Yeah, 80,000 divided by 9, which, because 9 months of summer salary and you divide by 9 gives you the cost for 1 month, and then that will give you a month of summer salary. These add up. So in my formula, we have academic year, summer, and then I use this second column to add up the total over that includes both the academic year and summer. Down below in the fringe benefit, okay, yeah, here's where it says fringe. I have a little formula because summer salary and academic year salary have different fringe rates because most institutions pay the health insurance all year, but it only gets paid for, or it gets completely paid for out of the 9 months of benefits. So in our institution, academic year benefits are 52%. It's a little bit lower for summer salaries, so the benefits are a little bit lower. Something to consider too when making up your budget. When do you want to pay people? Paying people in the summer is generally much cheaper than paying in the academic year because of this difference in benefits rates. And then with my setup, with this way the spreadsheet is set up, the benefits both for the academic year and the summer. And the reason that it's nice to have this little sum is because the portals where you'll have to enter your budget information generally do not care about academic year versus summer. They want to see the total compensation that each person will get. So it's nice to have it all added up. They also want to see the total fringe benefits you'll pay individual, not broken up by summer and academic year. So you have something that adds it all up. I have potentially, depending on the project. So I said, okay, the project would include staff. The reason I have this separated into full-time staff, part-time staff, and students is all of those have different fringe benefits rates. So I have the fringe benefits rate set up below in this section. So that's the rate for full-time faculty and staff. Part-time faculty and staff have a lower fringe benefits rate, and then students have the lowest fringe benefits rates of all. So I can put in people if I'm working with this spreadsheet, I put in people kind of on whatever line makes sense for the benefits that they should receive. Then it all totals up in the bottom of this column. And I go back to the subsequent years. So I have these formulas set up for a 2% increase in pay, which lately has been pretty optimistic, but if you don't budget for it, you won't get it, right? They never give you more than you ask for. So it's good to ask for it and plan for it in your budget. So it goes out, 2% increase a year for faculty and staff. So going down to the other budget categories, can put in, and for these, the way I set up my spreadsheet, numbers where it's just one number, travel and equipment, I put them here. The reason I have two columns again is things that might add up. So under other or contract, I guess maybe a better one. Under contracts, sometimes there's several different kinds of contracts, and I want to see them broken out because it helps me picture the program. And they can be broken out in the budget justification to help reviewers picture what the program is going to be like. If I'm going to pay the external evaluator $10,000, and I'm going to have a couple, maybe half a dozen workshop speakers, and they get a little honorarium. So I can put these together, and then they add up into $12,000. Like they add up into this overall contract. And then this is the total number that could be entered into the portal, right? When we're filling out budget forms to actually submit the grant, the budget form, they don't have this much detail. It's just this number. So it's nice to have a spreadsheet that combines detail to help you visualize the program and a sum that helps you understand how much total you're asking for in different categories in each year. You could do potentially the same thing if you have lots of different kinds of travel. You might want to add a line here if you have domestic travel and international travel, because several agencies like the National Science Foundation requires that those be entered separately, be entered individually if it's domestic and international. So it kind of depends a little bit on the grant program that you're applying for, how you want to divide up these kinds of subcategories. Participant costs, again, National Science Foundation grants want you to enter all these things separately, travel, tuition, and stipends. So you want to have those broken out separately on your spreadsheet. So some other things that Paul had talked about, mentioned the indirect cost. That's always a consideration. So I have that in my spreadsheet. I have several different totals. I have the total, this total other is the total for everything that's not personnel. and it totals, sums this column here, everything that's not personnel. And then I have a subtotal that's the direct cost, and it totals up personnel costs and then other, the non-personnel costs. Then we have to come up with indirect costs, right? You've got to render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, which is the indirect cost that the institution gets. The indirect cost base is the amount of money that the indirect cost is calculated over. And certain things are typically exempted from indirect costs. Say we were going to buy a big piece of equipment. So we've got this $100,000 piece of equipment. Right, that bumps up our total for non-salary to quite a lot, 112,000. But if you notice, our indirect cost base does not increase at all because equipment is generally exempt from indirect cost. So the formula that I have for the indirect cost takes the total, the subtotal here, the direct cost total, which is another thing it could be called, more transparently, this could be called direct cost total. So I take the direct cost total and subtract from it equipment, and then participant cost is frequently exempt from indirect costs as well. So that's subtracted, and this gives me my indirect cost base. This calculates, so in my institution, the indirect cost is 46% of the total direct minus these things that are not covered, the equipment and the personnel. So that's a formula for that. And I see I have this formula not quite correct. Okay, so then our total federal budget formula would be the indirect costs plus this subtotal, which is the total direct cost. And in fact, I'm going to change the title of that right while I'm thinking about. Let's call this total direct cost. Right, so we have total direct. The base does not get added in, right? Or then as I had it before, then you get too much money, and then your indirect cost, and then it totals it up. And then I have this spreadsheet set up that it totals it over all 5 years, that all these columns on this side are totaled, which is the cumulative. They all total over the total period of the grant. And then what happens if I only have a 3-year grant, then I just come and delete all these and adjust my totals here. And I should say the other thing I do, if you might have noticed, I have the spreadsheet set up typically so I have the spreadsheet set up so that for the non-personnel, other than equipment, right, that it just gets duplicated year after year. Here is just the formula. It's just whatever was the year before. And that's because typically, it's much easier conceptually to propose nearly the same thing year after year. It makes it a lot easier for reviewers. It makes it a lot clearer. And so that's kind of the default, that you're going to pretty much divide up your budget, your total budget, from year by year to about the same amount. And so I have the spreadsheet set up that way. Sometimes you don't want to do that, and then we have to change it. But at least set up this way, it gives me an idea. So if I have a 5-year grant and say the limit on the total budget, the agency had limited the total budget to $1 million. I put in some things and it's like, okay, great. I've got $240,000 to go. I can add some travel. I can add more personnel. Maybe I'll add a staff member. I can add a research assistant. Now I just type in one thing. This is why it's worth setting these things up. Even though it takes time, I can type in $40,000. The benefits are there, and it's like, oh my gosh, one research assistant at $40,000 over 5 years. Oop, I am way over $1 million. Right? This is kind of what Paul was referring to. If you don't have, it can be so helpful in designing your budget to have these things laid out, because then you can say, all right, if my budget for 5 years is limited to $1 million, it's like, okay, where am I cutting? Where can I cut? What can I propose, that will fit with this level of effort? Can I cut my own effort? Maybe teach, have less release time from teaching? Do I go to my administration and said, okay, if we're going to get this, you have to provide that release time at no cost, right? Then you can get an idea really early on what your budget can support related to the program you want to implement, and how you need to either adjust the program or find more resources. So I hope that helps.
Okay, and just for clarification, fringe and indirect, is that the funding agency sets those values, or does the institution? Where does that come from?
So it's a combination. The easy thing is the indirect cost. The indirect cost is negotiated between the institution and a federal agency. And most institutions will negotiate with one federal agency, and then that indirect cost applies to all federal agencies. But that's also an important point. Indirect cost is negotiated with federal agencies. So state grants or private grants, all bets are off, right? Then it's a totally different negotiations. They can either say, yes, use your federal rate, or they might say, no, we have our own rules. Foundations typically don't allow indirect cost at all, or allow at most 10%. States are different. My institution is a state institution, and so my state, if we get a state grant, they say, we're already giving you money. You don't get any more, right? We don't get indirect costs from state grants. Now, fringe benefits is a little different. Some institutions actually do negotiate a fringe benefits rate with federal agencies, and again, it's sort of the same principle. You negotiate with one, and then that rate applies to every agency. But most don't do that. So if you apply and have a negotiated fringe rate, that means that rate can be charged on every grant, no matter what the actual fringe rate costs. Because other than especially if you don't know who you're going to hire, fringe rates can vary a lot between different people depending on how much health insurance they get and that kind of thing. If for institutions, which is probably I think the majority that don't have a negotiated indirect cost rate, this number for us in my institution, it's 52%. That's just a ballpark estimate. The actual fringes could be higher or lower based on the choices of the individual, but the university can only charge the fringes it pays. The sponsored programs office will tell you what your indirect cost rate is and what fringe benefits rate to use. And that's one of the first things that you ask when you develop your budget, is you go to the sponsored programs website and pull down that information, because it will be there for you.
One of the biggest challenges is the whole personnel side of things, because it can get complicated, and it is costly, no doubt. And so having a template like she was working with, I have similar tools, and it does make a difference. And it's just, biggest point I think with the personnel is being honest with yourself and what you're trying to get done. It's easy to under budget because the personnel can get costly, but if you get under budgeted, you're also understaffed, and you may end up being overemployed and underpaid at the end of the day, and that's not good either for your project. So, try to be really conscious of that. Other people, then you struggle with, trying to fill in the other categories, the supplies and then, what am I going to need for supplies? I mean, maybe some paper. No, I can use that. I can get the paper around the corner. So, again, trying to really be thoughtful about program delivery. And so Melissa is too. I think we're more worried about supplies to do program delivery, education, and outreach. Scientists are more interested in the lab supplies and equipment, and for a lab, there's a lot of.
Yeah, I think that's another important point is about that can lower the stress of the budget. It's not for all time. It is a budget at the submission stage. The budget is about presenting a picture for the review, and it's not necessarily implementation, right? So if the grant gets awarded, that often gives you another opportunity to reassess what you need, and you can frequently rebudget, even right as it's awarded, right? If things have changed a lot, because there's a big lag between when a proposal's submitted and when it's funded, sometimes a year. So a lot can change in that time. And then even when you're implementing, if you think about a 5-year grant, by the time you get to year 3, right, when you first developed the budget, that was, ancient history. That's years and years ago. And agencies understand that. So there's a lot of flexibility. When you're preparing the budget for submission, you want to focus on meeting the expectations of people reviewing the grants. Implementation could be something different if you're lucky enough to get awarded. So that might lower the stress of it a little bit.
And Liz makes a good point. The implementation, as the reviewers are looking at your budget and your proposal, and they say, well, that's not making sense. So, and they say, well, we'll fund this, but make recommendations on how to reallocate your budget accordingly to better accomplish what you proposed. And again, that's based on recommendations coming from maybe some seasoned scientists or folks that have reviewed a lot of proposals, done similar work and that sort of thing. So the recommendations are often quite good and consistent with what you had proposed, but you really didn't correctly budget for it initial time. And I've seen that happen.
Do you all have any recommendations for how a potential PI should approach learning about fringe and the other complications in a budget if they don't have an expert at their particular institution?
Well, the HR people will have estimates for the fringe benefits. They'll be able to give they'll have, or payroll, one of those offices, if you talk, because they have to have those numbers to do the finances for the university. And to do budgeting for the university. So if there is no sponsored programs, those would be the people that do payroll and human resources would at least know that. If there isn't a negotiated indirect cost rate, the default rate for federal agencies, I believe, is 10%.
I think there's staff, NSF, that want to work with those institutions, and maybe identifying those individuals might be initially difficult. I think if you use your network and ask around, call around, and see who's at NSF has, that might be willing to work with your institution who's new to the game. And again, I know those individuals are there, and they're really, wanting to work with other underserved institutions, underfunded institutions as well, whether they're HSIs or minority serving institutions.
And I think also possibly for brand new institutions, if they're smaller, a brand new potential researcher with a inexperienced institution, that's a big reach. There's just so much to apply, but then to maintain it, that's really where the mentorship and partnerships with other institutions really would be beneficial.
I think it really does come back to what Melissa said earlier. Does the proposed body of work, operational plan, does it line up with your budget? I mean, having a lot of faculty salaries in there, but is not a problem at all, particularly if it is well demonstrated in the proposal that they're doing a significant amount of the work, and the success of the proposal depends on their level of involvement at the rate that you're involving them. But I think what does happen is that you see salaries in there or wages in there for research assistants and all that, but the proposal does not do a good job of justifying their role, their time in there, and it looks like they're just looking for wages to pay some people. Then it can be, the reviewers can pick up on that. They're pretty sensitive to the budget sides of things.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, Paul's absolutely right. I agree. The key is well justified. If it makes sense, and that's kind of what I said, your budget has to meet the expectations of the reviewers. If your reviewers are looking through and they look at the budget and it's like, yeah, to get this done, this is what it's going to cost, then you're fine with no matter what you're proposing. But yeah, as a reviewer, I have seen budgets where they've had, 4 or 5 people getting 1 month of summer salary each to do, just a couple seminars or something, you look at it and it's like, oh, this is just a way to pay people summer salary, right? They're not really going to be doing any work, right? And so then it's a problem. But you just have to explain it. And I think something we miss talking about really is the budget justification, because the budget justification is where you provide that detail, that explanation. And in a lot of grant mechanisms, the budget justification is not page limited, so you can explain in as much detail as you want. Now, nobody wants to read Gone with the Wind, right? They don't want to read pages and pages, but your goal with a budget justification should be clarity and explaining, and not really think about how to cram it into a lot of space. You want to provide as much information as possible, especially if you get reviewers like Paul, where the budget justification is going to be one of the first things they read. You want to have that information really clear and pretty detailed, so again, they can get a kind of picture of how your program is going to work based on what you're proposing to spend the money on.
I think it's interesting. I think a lot of applicants, that's the last thing they write is the budget justification. And by that time, their deadline's approaching, they're getting tired of this exercise, and they don't spend as much time developing those justifications as they could and should. It's a perfect opportunity to justify the time and expense of your personnel directly related back to the project. You know, again, in the budget justification, say, yeah, personnel A is going to cover activity A, B, and C. You know, and then, oh yeah, that's a big job. Yeah.
A paragraph, I think, for the personnel, right? If you're paying somebody more than a minimal amount of money, if you're paying them a substantial month of something close to a month or more, or more than that of salary, you want a paragraph that explains what they're going to be doing that to justify them getting that money. And the more information you can put there and to make the case there in the budget justification, it means you don't necessarily have to spend as much time or as much space in your proposal to say that. You can save some space in your management plan and really elaborate on what they're going to be doing in the budget justification. Again, because it's not page limited. And those details there can be really helpful to a lot of reviewers. I'm also somebody that reads the budget really early on.
The budget is funding the activities, those that are in the middle. And it's on both sides. Do these activities really lead that the research questions and objectives will be able to be met to create those outcomes? If the answer is yes, then all those activities are valid. If, like you, Melissa, you said that some of the activities for the amount that's being budgeted for summer, you're going like, these activities are not robust enough that are really moving the objective to the outcomes that really aren't necessary, then there's not a match to it. So when you're justifying the budget, you're justifying that the activities you've chosen are appropriate and that they are adequately being funded.
To include adequate communications and media is more and more important, because the documentation of the work we're asked to do is again, there's much more expectation that we do some better documentation throughout the project. Reporting, of course, is a part of that. But yeah, being able to have resources and students that can add value to the work as it's going. I know I'm on 2 projects now where we have a website up and going, so you can, the public at any time can come on and see exactly how the project is progressing and what's been accomplished in the different areas of the project that are clearly described on the website. I think that's a good point to make about budgeting.
Yeah, and these kinds of things money can be put either under consulting or potentially publications lines, you know, in the budget forms itself. So, you know, think about with the budget, this is something where it comes back to your budget can evolve as your program evolves for most agencies. But at the front end, when you're thinking, you want to if you think that's going to be something that's important as part of the outcomes and the dissemination of your project, you put some budget there to show the reviewers you're thinking about it, right? You put a reasonable amount of budget. And I would say anything under $1,000 is not meaningful. You want to budget somewhere $1,000 and up, depending on how big your budget is, to demonstrate that it's something that you're thinking about and that there's a plan. But this is another thing where I think it's we don't need to spend at the very front end, don't need to spend too much time agonizing over getting every dollar right, because it's just not possible for a lot of these things. It's until you actually start implementing, a lot of times we really don't know what it's going to be like. Oh, and we get great ideas. That's the other thing. Again, once you start implementing the project, that's when sometimes we sort of figure out how we really need to do it, right? Which wasn't so clear when you're trying to visualize the program. So keeping in mind, it's not for all time. You're proposing this, it's not for all time. You can modify it later, and you want to just have enough budget in those areas to show that you're thinking about it.
To me, the perspective, this is also part of the research process. If we actually truly know how the outcomes are going to be developing along the period of the grant, how much research is really there? We're really just duplicating something that has already been created. There's going to be a lot of unknown taking place, and I think our funding agencies realize that. That's part of the robustness of research.
Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations presented on the site do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation, NMSU, CSUN, or DACC. Thank you very much for being with us.